Hi everyone. I guess most of you have heard about the Impostor Syndrome. That's in Swedish, bluffsyndromet. It's a good example of an elephant in the room, something that people are aware about but don't talk about. It's about doubting yourself and your skills and your abilities and sort of feeling like a fraud, even if there's no actual rational science of it. It's often high-educated people who suffers from this, and it's been said that about 70% of us, at least sometimes in life, experience this very frightening feeling, And it's considered as a mystery, since it's smart people, often very high-educated and high achievers and so on. But my angle on this, I want to change the perspective and maybe say, this is maybe not a mystery at all. This, maybe we are all imposters. Maybe we are all frauds, because we pretend being adults without knowing what an adult is. Is there a proper definition of an adult, you can ask? Well, there's a biological answer and there's a cultural one. As nature considers us as adults from the time when we are sexually mature. That's quite obvious. If you can have a kid, you can't be a kid yourself anymore. That's quite given. So that normally occurs from the age of 12, 13. Maybe you don't have a kid, but you're capable of having a kid. And nature says we have to take response for our actions in this area. So nature considers us as responsible. And that is also the age around 12, 13. That's also the time when you are considered as an adult in traditional human cultures, often after a so-called initiation ceremony or something, some kind of complicated ritual which occurs when you are 12, 13 years old. We don't have those anymore. So from nature's perspective, the bottom line is responsibility. And for a long time, that sort of matched with the culture and society, social expectation of us. The culture and the biologic adulthood began at the same time, we can say. But nowadays, we can't accept a 12-year-old as an adult. That's absurd. That you can't cope with that. That's not an option. Our society has become so complicated that we need to postpone the time in life when you are supposed to have full responsibility. We need another definition of adult, a more culture and social definition of being an adult. And we are sort of moving in the area of 18 years old, 19 years old, maybe 20 years old, the late teens somewhere. In Sweden, for example, you can vote and drive a car, if you take a driver's license, that is, from the age of 18. You can buy liquor at the Systembolaget from the age of 20. So we're somewhere in that area. And this is interesting that we are in the area between the nature concept is the early teens, and we are sort of in the very late teens. So, and the concept teens and the concept teenager is interesting because this is new. In language history, this is new. This is about 100 years we have talked about teens and teenagers. That's a new word, a new concept in the early 1900s. So before this, there were no teenagers. Maybe there were, but they didn't know about it. Okay, because we didn't have this concept. You couldn't say teenager or tonåring or something. Of course, we had people that were between 13 and 19 years old. That's okay, I give you that, all right. But maybe this is not a coincidence. The teens is a period that almost exactly covers the gap between the beginning of biological adulthood, and the more vague cultural one that we are sort of mixturing with. And the teens are the period in between those two. So this is a period when you are biologically not a child and culturally not an adult. You're sort of in a kind of purgatory. Okay. We have some interesting examples in how we got more and more confused about what an adult is. We can take an example from fashion. So hairdos have sort of ruined some stuff for us. Before the 1920s, there was a very clear distinction between a young woman, a non-adult woman, and an adult woman. Every woman, all the women had long hair. But if you were an adult woman, a married woman, you had your hair up. And if you were a young woman, not married, you had your hair let out, rash hair. And when everyone cut their hair in the 20s, in this area, sort of shingled hairdo, that became totally unusual. You couldn't have any information on that. Everyone had the same kind of hairdo because that was fashion. And concerning to men, the common and very well-known distinction between a boy that has a cap and a man, an adult man that wears a hat, completely was ruined in the 60s and 70s with a bare-headed fashion. Okay, so we're very unsure about the concept of adultness, and it's getting harder and harder for us to find like functionary symbols and stuff, and the whole society is frequently changing, so we're getting more and more confused. I can take some examples from my childhood. In my home, we had some stuff that I thought was very typical for being an adult. We had a grape scissor, for example, that my mom and dad used because you're not supposed to leave ugly things after you if you pick. You're not supposed to pick one grape from the grape cluster. You're supposed to pick a whole grain, so you keep the grape cluster nice and neat and proper and so on. We had complimentary cigarettes for guests. There should all be guest cigarettes at the table, and a table lighter and an ashtray with my dad's monogram on it. I thought this was typical adultness for me. It also included driving with special driving gloves and having a subscription of a newspaper that came in the post every morning. So I thought this was things that I could have used from when I grow older, but it turned out that it all was just cultural phenomena. They are all dated today. You don't have any use of it. I don't have an ashtray at home. I don't have cigarette for guests or stuff like that. But there were much other things, like paying bills and taxes and having an umbrella if there's a rainy forecast. That was part of the adulthood that I needed to learn. But I didn't know which one I should pick and which one I shouldn't pick. And we tend to confuse culture generations with age generations, so to speak. Rock and roll music is a good example. It used to be believed that rock and roll music was young music for the youngsters, but it turned out it has nothing to do with age. It's just a generation who happened to be young when rock music occurred. Today you talk about dad rock. Rock music is certainly very middle-aged today. And we can have an example for that. Today is very typical for young people who have tattoos. This will not be typical for young people in 30 or 40 years. Everyone can see that. That will be typical for people in their 70s, when people who's today in their 30s will keep their tattoos. A friend of mine said, if you should get a person and understand them, don't look at their age, look at the year they're born. So if we take, for example, a 70-year-old person, and I try to understand a 70-year-old person that I know, I look at my grandmother and say, what did she like when she was 70 years old? Well, she took a bus trip to Holland to see the tulips in full bloom. That's what a 70-year wants in life. But that's not useful today. A 70-year-old is born 1952 and was about 14, 15 years when you're most musically influenced in mid-60s. So a 70-year-old today would probably want to go see a concert with the Rolling Stones. That's not even dad rock, that's granddad rock, you know. So we confuse age and generation identity. And these days, the most important thing is maybe not how old you are, it's it's more with the generation cohort, which generation cohort you belong to. And the concept of a generation cohort is a new concept we started talking about. Instead of talking about the young generation, the middle-aged generation, the older generation, we try to find information, for example, in the generation that was young during the 80s and the 90s. In this case, also known as Generation X. That's a generation cohort. That's the first generation cohort that we put a name on. And that is a sign that the whole concept of the word generation is changing. It has less to do with age, since Generation X will maybe continue to have their ironic attitude throughout life, even when they're old. And it has much more to do with culture and social experience. Now, interesting. This phenomenon with generation cohorts coincides in a very interesting way in time with the discovery of the Impostor Syndrome, which is known from the late 70s. Where the Generation X were in their early teens or somewhere like that. And it also, there's also an interesting connection with a new word. I don't know how many of you know about the word adulting. That's a new word in the English language. Adulting, new verb. And it's been more and more frequently used these late decades. No one can say exactly how old it is, but I can give you a wink that has very recently been accepted in the Oxford Dictionary. And that means that the word is probably at least 20, 30 years old or something, but it takes some time. And the definition in the Oxford Dictionary is a practice of behaving in the manner of a responsible adult, especially in completing everyday tasks. Don't miss the distinction. It's not behaving adult. It's behaving in the manner of an adult. There's an important distinction there. And this word is also widely used nowadays as a term for pretending to be an adult. It's often used in a playful way. You can make a comparison. In Sweden, we have a word vuxenpoäng, which means adult points. That's something you get when you do things that you think you're supposed to do as an adult. If you have, buying in bulk at the supermarket or having couples dinners, that gives very high adult points. Not to speaking about subscribing for a paper newspaper. That's just up in the roof somewhere. Okay. So the word adulting is new, because you didn't need it in the earlier days. People didn't need this word. When something is really given and obvious, you don't need a word for it. We can make a comparison. We can compare this with the word nature. We think as nature as something very obvious, but for very, very, very many years, people didn't need any word for this. We didn't have any word for nature. The word nature is borrowed from a Latin word that actually means birth. And we borrowed it into different European languages a couple of hundred years ago when we started to leave nature, when we started to move into the cities and no longer live among nature. And if you think about it, what we really mean with nature and what we mean with nature is quite unclear. For example, you can analyze the phrase natural ingredients. It says on things you buy, all natural ingredients. Think about it. What's not a natural ingredients? Everything comes from nature. It's just more or less processed. So this is a confusing word. But when we choose to distance ourselves from something, as we choose to distance ourselves from nature, when we started to build cities and live in a more modern and high technology society, we started to see nature as an object, which we all know is quite a problem with environment issues and climate changes and so on. But that's not the case here. we see it as an object, something outside ourselves. And that's quite similar to what happens when we try to distance ourselves from the older definition of being an adult. That is nature's definition. That's you're an adult when you're not a kid anymore. You can have kids and you're an adult. You're an adult from 12, 13 years old, and we say, no, we can't handle that. That would be chaos. So we try to put up a new definition of adulthood or something. And that becomes something that we objectify and see as partly as something outside of ourselves, as we're not longer a part of nature. We're not really a part of adulthood either. You can make this comparison. As a nature, nature to us is something that we can see and we know and we can pay visits to. We can make excursions into nature. We can do like picnic, camping, hiking and something, sleeping in a tent or something. And we can feel like, oh, I'm a part of nature. Nature and I'm sort of like one. And we can pretend that we are a real part of it, but then we just can return to our civilized homes and living our very more comfortable life. And we can compare this to the relation we're starting to have with adulthood. Adulthood is something that we can make excursions to. I can go to adulthood, I can play, I can do adulting for a while. I can pretend to be an adult, I can act like an adult, and then I can just go back to my ordinary life. So if no one really knows what it is being an adult, then we're all pretending to be something that we secretly are deeply unsure of. Then we're all imposters in a world where we have responsibilities, but we don't really know what these responsibilities are. Thank you.